India's wage crisis affects almost all of its workforce, but the chapter argues that the wage insecurity is even deeper for seasonal circular migrants. It explores two key reasons as to why this might be. First, it takes a closer look at India's labor market and argues that this is not just an economic institution that is shaped by economic factors like the supply or demand of work, the skill level of workers, or the level of technological inputs. Rather, it is a highly social space as well, and it is structured by social hierarchies which are mirrored and copy pasted onto the labor market, such that those who have historically found themselves oppressed and marginalized in the Indian society will similarly find themselves at the bottom spheres of the Indian labor market.
The crisis created by the pandemic and the public empathy for migrant workers in this situation provided an opportunity to engage in a process of reforms that addressed the structural issues at the root of India's labor market, which relies on the exploitation of vulnerable migrant workers. But the opportunity seems lost. Rather, public and policy debate today operates within a binary, that the revival of the economy in the post-pandemic phase is not possible alongside a strong labor protective framework, which is viewed as an impediment to India's economic growth. When overwhelming evidence from within India and across the world shows that low and insecure wages does not translate to economic growth but has the opposite effect.
It is well understood now that the outcomes from migration can differ a lot depending on the social group you belong to. So the migration of dominant caste groups have brought upward mobility and anti-poverty sort of effects. But for seasonal circular migrants, this form of very extractive, corrosive work actually just leads to an intergenerational transfer of poverty, in which children whose parents have been seasonal circular migrants are most likely to grow up in an environment of deprivation, with lack of money being invested in their health, nutrition, education, such that they enter the labor market in much the same conditions as their previous generation.
This is the situation of millions of poor in India who depend on wage labor for their survival. The pandemic crisis reveals that the wage is not simply a feature of the market. Rather, it has great socio-economic significance in a country like India, as it determines the ability of workers and their households to survive. This is why the protection of wages has remained a central component of labor struggles over the years. It finds its basis in the Constitution, in international frameworks, and also in Indian labor legislations. It is from this perspective that this chapter in the India Exclusion Report views wages as a public good to be protected by the state.
The second discussion of the chapter is to look at the nature of the Indian state and show how it's been complicit in producing and reproducing these forms of wage insecurity amongst workers, especially migrant workers. It talks about how the labor policies have changed over time, the hollowing out of its regulatory mechanisms, the caste and gender bias, which is entrenched in the response of the state while interacting with workers. One particular aspect that it discusses at length is how the justice architecture of the country, its labor courts, the labor department, the legal aid services, lacks a fundamental understanding of informal work itself.
As a public good, we argue that the state plays three roles in protecting wages. One, the state must be able to act as an enabler and establish mechanisms to set adequate wages in the first place that permit workers and their families to fulfill their basic economic, social, and cultural needs. This includes both coherent methodologies to set a floor of minimum wages that allows these communities to meet a basic standard of living, as well as inclusive processes such as the augmenting of workers' collective bargaining platforms to demand wages that are over and above the minimum wage, and that prevents the cheapening of labor as it improves labor share in profits based on the firm's capacity to pay. Second, the state must act as an enforcer. The reality of pervasive wage thefts and arbitrary deductions of workers' wages, which are used as measures for cost cutting by employers, needs to sort of be addressed by enforcing existing labor legislations. This is possible only if the state takes a stronger supervisory and regulatory role over industry to ensure that violations are reported and punitive measures are taken to curb and discourage non-compliance to the labor law. Third, the state must act as a direct provider. This means that the institutions which are responsible for justice must be made accessible to workers, and they must be made more effective in responding to wage violations by employers, especially in the case of informal migrant employment, such that economic growth, which is both inclusive and based on the protection of workers' socio-economic rights, can once again enter public and policy debate as both legitimate and possible.